Okay guys, so in our last unit we talked about the visual elements of art, and today we're going to be talking about the principles of design. So the principles of design are created by, in a lot of ways, combining the visual elements. So think about it. Shapes can be combined together to create pattern. They can also be used to create unity or variety. And so we're going to start with the term composition. Composition refers to the organization of visual elements. And so today we're going to be talking about the principles of design and break down the components of compositions within works of art. So our first two principles of design are unity and variety. And these two terms really lay at opposite ends of the spectrum. So with unity, we're going to be looking at works that have a sense of wholeness or oneness. They're very cohesive works of art. While the flip side of that would be variety. And variety is going to provide diversity within a work of art. And the sameness of too much unity can be very boring, but also too much variety can cause a work of art to be very chaotic and very busy and hard to understand. So oftentimes we're going to see these used together. Our first example, Untitled from 1970 by John McCracken, is an example of unity. So here we have a work that has almost complete unity. The entire piece is the same color or the same shade of yellow, and the only kind of variation we're getting is a very small amount in the thickness and the size of the wood. Otherwise, the piece is almost completely unified. So here we have an example by Tara Donovan, who is an American artist. She uses all sorts of everyday kind of household items within her work, and this could be plastic cups, number 2 pencils, drinking straws, and she uses these to create visually complicated and really surprisingly complex structures. So in her Untitled from 2003, we have the kind of repetitive pattern and usage of styrofoam cups. So she approaches her art very differently. Most artists begin with a sketch or an outline, but for Donovan, she approaches it by letting the medium kind of speak for itself. So here with the Untitled sculpture with styrofoam cups, as she would adhere them to one another, she really kind of let them create a dialogue for themselves. So in this work, we have kind of organized clusters of these styrofoam cups that are held together with hot glue, and they create this kind of cloud-like pattern. This particular one spans 25 feet wide and 6 feet high, and it absorbs and diffuses light within the room where it's at, so it creates kind of shadows and patterns on the floor and on the wall. And this is a really cool example because we actually the Birmingham Museum of Art in downtown Birmingham has an iteration of her styrofoam cup series, and so I highly recommend checking that out whenever you're in Birmingham. So variety refers to the elements of a composition that differ from one another. So they create visual interest. They also, as in this case, the Wassily Kandinsky, they create energy. A lot of variety in a work, as I said, can make an artwork look very busy. It can make it be very overwhelming to view. So oftentimes it will be paired with unity to kind of soften the image. In this particular example, we're seeing a lot of variety though. We have different color lines, different thickness, different directions of those lines. We also have different shapes. We have some more kind of geometric shapes with the round colors. We also have very organic shapes. And then we also have a great variety in color. We've got warm colors, cool colors that are being used side by side. So not really any unity within this particular work. Our next example is an example where unity and variety have come together to kind of peacefully coexist within this work. So this image on the left is the color original version of Going Home by Jacob Lawrence. And you can kind of see here that this perfect merging of unity and variety has created a visually complex but also a visually appealing image. He's established a theme with each of the figures and with the train seats. But as your eye moves through the composition, each section or each group of train seats has been varied in some slight form. But the work has also been unified in the way in which he has used the color red throughout the entire composition, but also in the fact that his varied work within his varied element has been a repetitive kind of triangular shape. So you notice in the black and white image on the right, you can see where we've got this repetition of triangular forms seen in the train seats. So here we've got this kind of perfect coexistence of both variety and unity working together. Our next principle is balance. So balance is the achievement of equilibrium in a work of art. We also strive for balance in our everyday lives, so it's only natural that we would seek balance in the art we look at or the art that we create. So think about the yin-yang symbol that you have before you. This represents perfect balance and harmony, both in our mind but also visually. Notice how there's an equal amount of white and black. It's also symmetrically balanced, because if you cut it in half and folded it over, the sides would be matching. But balance can be achieved in multiple ways. You can have symmetrical balance, like we're seeing here, but we can also have asymmetrical balance, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. So here we kind of have a visual breakdown of the three different types of symmetry or balance that we're going to talk about. We have symmetrical balance on the left, which is where a work of art is equally weighted on both sides. In the center, we have asymmetrical balance, which is where one side, either the left or the right side of the composition, is going to be more heavily weighted. And then on the far right, we have radial symmetry or radial balance. And this is when the composition of the work revolves around a central focal point. So look here at these two images of architecture. Architecture is a great example of symmetrical balance. So here the drawing or the design at the top, the James Hoban design for the president's home. This is a Georgian style mansion, and the drawing is perfectly symmetrical. You're going to notice that the center of the architecture is centered under a triangular pavilion. The windows are identical; they're evenly placed. You've got 4 columns, 2 on either side of the kind of the center or the central axis of the building. And today, after 2 centuries and many renovations, this building we know of as the White House. So this is where the president lives. And you can see that while there has been some maybe visual aesthetic changes to the structure, it's still a very symmetrical building. We also see symmetrical balance in other places. So like the sculpture here of an idol, we have, if you were to bisect this statue long ways and cut it into 2 equal halves straight down the middle, or the central axis, each side or each half is going to be perfectly identical. So this is also true with our bodies. The human body is actually perfectly symmetrical with the exception of our heart. So we are symmetrical beings in and of ourselves. We see this in sculpture, and we can also see this in collage, painting. So here we have an example of perfect symmetry, Damien Hirst and The Holy Place. This particular work was made by the artist using butterfly wings. These were actual real butterfly wings that were sourced from a local farm that raised butterflies, and he used this to create this perfectly matched work. If you notice and look closely, each side of the central axis is perfectly matched 1 for 1. Each butterfly wing has been chosen as a perfect match to another to place on either side of this work to create this perfect balance, this almost stained glass-like image that we have before us. Also, a lot of the time with symmetrical balance, especially images like this where we have a perfect balance, if you were to fold them in half long ways, they're going to match and line up perfectly. So, as I said, we have symmetrical balance. We also have asymmetrical balance. And this is where there's not an equilibrium within the composition. Instead, elements within the work are placed according to their significance. So in our example here, by the artist Fontana, we have a story from the Bible where Mary Magdalene is going to clean the tomb of Christ and stumbles upon this gardener, or who she thinks is a gardener, and later finds out is actually Christ. So in the image you have before you, you notice that we have one figure, the figure of Christ, standing. Then we have the figure of Mary Magdalene kneeling beside him. This creates an issue within the balance of the image. But the artist has used some kind of countermeasures to help make it a visually appealing and not so jarring image. So let's look at weight, the weight of an image. So notice that the dress that Mary Magdalene is wearing is very thick. It's very kind of large. It's coming off of her a little bit. And notice that creates some extra weight on her side of the composition. Also notice that in this particular image, the figures in the background before her, the smaller figures, help to kind of counteract and create a more balanced approach within the composition. It helps to kind of counter this asymmetrical balance in the foreground. So if we compare this image with the last, we're looking at the same story. This new painting is by Titian, an Italian artist, and we can see how another artist approached this idea of asymmetry. So we have the same figure group. We have Christ standing with Mary Magdalene kneeling beside him. And Titian's approach to kind of counteracting this asymmetry is more subtle. Christ himself is weighted more heavily because he's standing. And he also has the tree behind him, which helps to distribute weight on his side or on the left side of the composition. But also for Titian, placing Mary in a red garment, red advances towards the viewer and helps to kind of create this illusion of more weight on her side of the composition. Also notice that if you kind of split the image down the middle, you have Christ and the tree on the left side, but then you have Mary Magdalene and the town in the distance on the right. So while the foreground may seem asymmetrical, we have kind of a visually equally weighted painting here with the way and the elements that Titian has placed within the composition. Now an extreme example of asymmetrical balance would be Edgar Degas' Jockeys Before the Race. In this particular painting, he grounds the composition with this bold, stark, very kind of jarring line that runs through from top to bottom. But notice that the line is off center and to the right of the painting. So when you first look at it, seemingly the center of the work is not actually center. Your eye is kind of immediately drawn to this line, but the next thing you're likely to notice is the sun, this kind of lone circle in the sky that is on the left side of the composition. The artist is also using warm color tones like Titian did to create and to kind of help give the illusion of a more equally weighted image. So notice that the jockeys are both the two jockeys that are further from us are both wearing kind of a pink or corally shirt, and then the jockey in the middle is wearing a red hat, which these colors advancing towards the viewer help to equally kind of distribute the weight, or at least give the illusion in doing that within the composition. Our last example of balance is radial balance. And this is when all elements revolve around a central point. So here we have an album, in a kind of an illuminated manuscript that was created for the Shah Jahan. And notice that everything is pivoting from this central point. The Shah Jahan was a serious collector of gems, and so this album of calligraphies was created as a gift for the Shah Jahan, and we see the influence of his gem collecting or his fascination with gems. We also see elements or qualities of architecture within this work. Next, we have emphasis. And emphasis can be used to draw the viewer's attention to certain areas within a work of art. Notice on how this Titian painting that we've already talked about, notice that in the composition, your eye is drawn to their bodies, or to the figures in the center. Their bodies are both lighter in color than the green space around them. This helps to kind of set them apart from the background. They are also in the center of the composition, so your eye is immediately kind of drawn there. And as such, their interaction becomes the focal point of the work of art, which makes sense, right? As they and the story that's being told about Christ and Mary Magdalene is what the painting is about. In this version of the story, the focal point is less clear. And in this work, we're getting a sense of the idea of subordination. And subordination is when the artist uses neutral areas of lesser interest within the composition to keep us from being distracted by the areas of emphasis. So in this particular image, our eye is kind of immediately drawn to the dead center of the composition, which is the face of Mary. This places her in an area of emphasis and leaves Christ as a subordinate figure or element within the composition. In this particular image, we also have a secondary focal point in the empty tomb, which is placed in the back of the composition. So in this image, the artist is kind of moving your eye, and she hasn't placed one specific important focal point within the work. She's got you looking at both the figure of Mary Magdalene, but also of the empty tomb, which brings Christ and his role in this story back to the forefront. So next we have directional forces. Directional forces are paths for our eyes to follow within a work of art. They influence the way in which we look at art. This could be done by creating implied lines within the work to help guide your eye around the composition. So in the example we have before us by Francisco Goya, Goya has isolated the man and the bull in the center of the composition. He's also created this kind of sense of drama and suspense by having spectators in the background. By placing the bullfighter in midair, he has also created a sense of motion and movement, and this begins to show us the directional forces within this work. So in this diagram, look at how the bullfighter has been placed on a hard diagonal line that runs the full composition of the work. It runs from corner to corner. Notice how the fighter's leg helps to reinforce this hard diagonal line. Goya has also balanced the hard diagonal line with another set of two diagonal lines that run from the bull's feet up to its back, creating perpendicular lines to the initial diagonal. Also notice how the bullfighter's hand has been placed where at the exact point where the hard horizontal and hard vertical lines meet to kind of create a sense of emphasis. We can see the two diagonal lines coming or stemming from the bull's feet more clearly in this diagram. So you've got this other directional force that's running up from the ground through the bull. This is helped and kind of continued by the shadow of the man that is introduced by a light source and the shadow that's being cast from that on the ground. And as we continue to examine the work, we see a triangular form kind of forming from these lines and the directional lines within this composition. So we get this kind of triangular form that centers around the figure of the bullfighter and the bull himself. So, repetition. Repetition is the regular occurrence of visual elements within a work of art. So this could be something like pattern. It could also be done through color. So with the repetition that we're seeing here, we've got pattern that it kind of refers to the overall pattern. Sorry guys. So pattern refers to the overall design of a work that is created by a repetitive ordering of elements. So here in this example, we have a rug from Afghanistan, and the weavers in this region have always used imagery from their everyday lives in the objects that they create. And since the outbreak of the Afghan War in 2001, we have seen a rise in rugs that bear war imagery, like the one we see here. So inside the border, which is in and of itself a pattern, we have a repetition in the images of the cars, helicopters, grenades, and so forth. And this repetition of objects becomes a pattern in and of itself. So rhythm kind of goes along with pattern. They work hand in hand. And rhythm refers to the regular or ordered repetition of elements within a work or a space. So a subtle use of rhythm can be seen here in an image from the Pantheon in Paris. So within this structure that's based on the Roman Pantheon, we have a series of shapes that have been repeated throughout the building. So notice how the dome and the pattern within the dome has been repeated in the pattern on the floor and in the tile. You can actually notice that all of the architectural elements and patterns created on the ceiling have been repeated in the tile below them on the floor. We also see a repetition or a sense of rhythm in the columns that run along one after the other, and also in the archways. So the Pantheon in Paris was created originally as a church, and it was dedicated to Saint Genevieve, and it was used to house certain relics. But after many functions today, it serves as a mausoleum, and it contains the remains of many distinguished French citizens. So Japanese artist Ogata Karen has created rhythm within this pair of folding screens. The simplified bodies of the crane or the crane birds has been repeated with slight variations in their stance. Also notice that the beaks of the cranes create a directional force within the composition that kind of ironically runs your eye towards the empty space, or this empty portion on the left-hand side. Each of the cranes is also facing this direction and is seemingly kind of walking towards, almost as if they're going to eventually walk off of the composition. So scale is the size relation of one thing to another, and proportion is the size relationship of parts to a whole. So let's start with scale. Scale is always one of the first considerations for an artist. They oftentimes think about how big is the work actually going to be. Often when we think about scale, we think about it in relation to ourselves and our bodies. And scale can often determine how we approach a work of art. If a work is very large in scale, maybe larger than us, we can view it maybe in awe, or sometimes it can evoke fear because it is so large. Whereas if you're looking at something that is a small work of art, it becomes more approachable for you to view and to look at and consider. So before we get into looking at actual works of art and discussing scale, let's look at the diagram here. So often when we look at a photograph, especially a photograph of a work of art in a textbook, it can distort how we see the image. So I have something for you to consider. Have you ever looked at a short person standing next to a tall person? When this occurs, it often will make the short person seem much shorter and the tall person seem much taller than they actually are. This is due to their relationship when they are standing next to one another. It becomes exaggerated by being placed next to each other. So here, and the diagram of the scale relationships, we have this same kind of thing. So look at the two figure groups before you, the large scale and the smaller one. Do you notice anything similar of each, or maybe something different? Look at the dots in the center. Do they look like they're the same size? Well, they are. So the dots in the center of each of these figure groups is actually the exact same size. Artists often work with distortion in their art. So here we have the smallest work of art ever created. This was created by a Brazilian artist. And this work is usually shown in photographs with a human hand to give you an idea of just how small it is. So the work of art itself that we're talking about is actually this small image here. So it's very tiny. The work was created as a political statement by the artist about the lack of importance usually attributed to countries in the southern hemisphere. So as a Brazilian artist, this was a topic that was very kind of near and dear to them. She also did this because these countries often produce goods, things like lumber, that has then exported around the world. And so this particular work is actually made up of two very small blocks of wood that are less than a ½ inch in size. So you can naturally assume that something this small creates a problem in the museum setting. So obviously it would have to be on a pedestal under a dome of glass, but even when you do that, people would easily miss it because it's such a small work of art. So here we have a sculpture that is in direct contrast with the last work that we looked at. So this is a work entitled Shuttlecocks, and it is a large scale, it's a 1 of 4 large scale sculpture done by artists Oldenburg and Van Bruggen. These are actually located in Kansas City, Missouri, outside of the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. So each of the four structures is arranged kind of in their outdoor lawns off of the north and south facades of the building. It weighs in at over 5,000 pounds. So these are very, very heavy works. And what is being depicted here is the kind of, the best way I can describe it is the ball-like object that's used in badminton. And here it appears as though it has fallen between the net, and the artist is using the net as, or the museum as the net, kind of in a mocking manner, mocking the prim appearance of the museum. This particular work, and their series of works, has not been widely accepted Many people believe it to be very frivolous. This includes a negative editorial from the local paper, issues being brought up by the department and the board members of the city's Department of Parks and Rec. So, both works of art that are extremely small and extremely large can hold and kind of pack a punch and hold a good meaning. So not all scale has to be so extreme. So such a small work or such a large work. Here in this particular painting, it's a painting by Andrew Wyeth. It's called Christina's World. This is an encaustic painting. This is a tempera painting, and we're seeing here how scale is being used in a different way. Instead of talking about the actual size of a work of art, we're talking about using scale to show depth. So notice the buildings in the back are very small, whereas the young girl laying in the foreground is much larger. And the artist has used the scale in proportion within this composition to give you a sense of depth within the work. Scale can also be seen in paintings such as this by Georgia O'Keeffe. We've got the painting Two Calla Lilies on pink. And here she uses scale to challenge the viewer's perception of this image. So we have a painting of two calla lilies against a pink backdrop. But the painting itself is actually more than 3 feet tall. So she has enlarged the scale of the actual canvas and thus the flowers on it to bring attention to the kind of abstract beauty that we see within flowers. She's also been quoted as saying, "What is my experience of the flower if not color?" So she has used color in conjunction with the large scale of the painting to draw attention to specific elements within the flower. So you see, even though it's a white flower, you see the folds and the creases and the contrast in the white against the pink and the green and the yellows. So proportion and composition, and how proportion works within composition. So a change in proportion can make a difference in the viewer's experience of a subject or of a work of art. So we're going to look at two pietà scenes. And pietà is the Italian word for pity. And within these scenes, we're looking at an image of Mary holding the dead, limp body of Jesus or of Christ. So first we're going to examine Michelangelo's, which is arguably the most famous pietà scene that we have. In this image, or in this image that you're looking at, we have a photograph of the sculpture, and it's showing an image of a grown man, Christ, that is laying across his mother's lap. this image and this figure group is not an easy one to get right. So Michelangelo did this by altering the figure in the body of Mary. While the heads of the two figures are actually the exact same in size, Mary's body has been enlarged and altered to hold the weight and the size of Christ. So if she were to stand tall, she would actually, she would be over 8 feet tall. So she's not realistic in scale whatsoever. But look at the image. Look at this image of Mary holding her son in her lap. It doesn't look that distorted. It doesn't look as if the figure of Mary is much larger in size and scale and proportion to that of Christ or of Jesus. So we don't immediately see this difference, and in some cases we don't ever see the difference or notice the difference in the proportions and how they have been changed. So next we're going to look at a wooden sculpture of the Pietà scene, and this particular work is about 200 years prior, or was completed 200 years prior to the Michelangelo Pietà marble sculpture. So here in this work, the artist has actually chosen to leave both figures at the same height. So they're both the same height, and the way that the artist has gone about kind of alleviating the awkwardness of having a grown man sitting on a woman's body is to make the body of Christ very bony and gaunt and kind of emaciated. Also, the heads of each of these figures has actually been enlarged just slightly, and they're kind of out of proportion to their bodies. And this was done to kind of heighten the expressive quality of the work and of the sculpture. So let's look at them side by side so you can kind of get a feel for them and how they look together. So here we've got the two Pietà scenes side by side. And notice that while the Michelangelo sculpture has placed Mary completely out of proportion in relation to the body of Christ, the scene created by Michelangelo looks more proportional, even though it's not. And you can contrast that with the Pietà scene on the left, and even though the figures are actually the same size, or at least the same height, that it looks very awkward. Having the emaciated, kind of bony body of Christ makes him look smaller, and having those enlarged heads on both the figure of Mary and of Christ in the image on the left, it kind of creates this disproportionate composition. So guys, that is it for the principles of design. So don't forget to answer the questions that are located right below this video and include those in your lecture notes.